watching the gym went dead silent the moment the champion spat at the janitor's feet. Nobody in that room knew the quiet old man mopping the floor had survived things most people can't even imagine. What happened in the next 3 minutes changed that gym forever. The neon sign outside Warhorse Fitness buzzed and flickered, throwing a sickly green light across the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, chalk, and old vinyl. It was a place built for the vain and the violent, a temple of mirrors and inflated egos. In the corner, dragging a gray mop across the black mats, was Walt. Nobody looked at Walt twice. In a room full of flexed muscles and self-admiring glances, a man pushing 60 in a faded army surplus jacket was basically invisible. He slept in a beat-up Chevy Astro van parked behind the building. Marcus, the gym's owner, let him park there and run the mop in exchange for $50 a week and free access to the showers. It wasn't charity exactly. It was pity dressed up as a job. Walt didn't mind. Pity was quiet. Pity left him alone. He moved with a stiff, careful rhythm, his left knee grinding with every step, a souvenir from a dirt road outside Kandahar 2 decades earlier. His hands were rough with old scar tissue, hands that had built shelters, carried rifles, and once held a dying friend together. Now they wrung dirty water into a yellow bucket. He preferred it that way. The bucket never screamed at him. Across the room, one sound cut through everything else, a sharp crack of shin against leather. Colton was holding court. At 24, Colton was the gym's prized fighter and its biggest headache. Undefeated amateur record, a blue checkmark online, and the humility of a man who'd never lost anything that mattered. Tonight he wasn't training, he was bullying. "Hands up, Derek. Come on, you're moving like you're pregnant," Colton barked, his voice bouncing off the tin ceiling. Derek, a college kid just trying to shed some weight, was pinned against the cage, gasping, headgear knocked sideways. Colton didn't ease off. He fired a fast combination and finished with a liver kick that folded Derek in half. Derek dropped to his knees, wheezing. Colton didn't check on him. He just strutted away, admiring himself in the wall of mirrors, running a gloved hand over his fade. Everyone watched. Nobody said a word. Colton brought in new members, and that bought him a lot of silence. Walt paused his mopping, resting his chin on the handle, watching not the show but the mechanics underneath it. Colton was fast, no question, but sloppy. He dropped his right hand every time he loaded a left hook. He threw kicks without setting them up. In a ring with a referee, that was enough to win. In a real fight, it was enough to get you killed. Walt went back to his mop, not his circus. Still buzzing with adrenaline, Colton walked to the water cooler, took a long swig from his sports drink, and spat a mouthful onto the floor Walt had just cleaned. The wet splash echoed through a lull in the music. Walt stopped. He looked at the puddle, then at Colton. "Missed the trash can," he said, quiet but it carried. Colton turned, sizing him up, the scuffed boots, the frayed jacket, the gray beard. An easy target to flex on. "I pay $200 a month to train here, old man. You get paid in loose change." "Clean it up." "Floor was clean," Walt said. "You made it dirty, have some respect." The gym went quieter, the speed bag stopped. Colton laughed and stepped directly into the wet spot, dragging it across the dry mat. "Respect? You live in a van that smells like cat piss. Don't lecture me." "Mop the floor before I make you lick it up." Walt didn't flinch. "You drop your right hand when you throw the left," he said, flat, almost clinical. "You lift your chin when you kick. You fight like someone who's never actually been hit." The insult landed harder than any personal jab could have. Colton's face went dark red. He hurled his water bottle at the wall, glass and liquid scattering everywhere. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you've got bad habits," Walt murmured, meeting his eyes with the flat, unshakable calm of a man who'd already seen the worst the world had to offer. "And bad habits get people hurt. Put the mop down right now. I will break you." Every eye in the building locked onto the water cooler. Marcus came jogging out from the office, clipboard against his chest. He saw the shattered bottle, the puffed-up champion, and the motionless janitor. "Whoa, Colton, back off." "He's just doing his job." Colton shoved his hand away. "He's disrespecting me, in my gym." "He's an old man, Colton, leave it." Walt placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, the grip surprisingly firm. "It's fine, Marcus, let him vent." "Vent," Colton spat. "Get on the mat, unless you're all talk, Granddad." Walt looked at the sparring ring, its blue canvas glowing under the halogens. He hadn't stepped onto a mat in anger in 15 years. He looked back at the trembling, furious kid in front of him and recognized something familiar in it. That same hollow rage he used to see in young recruits who thought war was a movie. Right up until the first explosion tore that illusion apart. He set the mop down. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. "Walt, you don't have to do this," Marcus whispered. "He doesn't know when to stop." "I know," Walt said, pulling off his boots. "Neither do I." He stepped into the ring. No bounce, no warm-up, and stood dead center, feet planted, hands loose at his sides. He looked completely defenseless and completely immovable at the same time. Colton vaulted over the ropes, already gloved up, smacking his fists together. "No rounds, no ref. You tap or you sleep." Walt just blinked. "Whenever you're ready, son. If you think you know how this fight goes, you're about to be very wrong." Colton exploded forward, throwing a massive looping right aimed at Walt's jaw. A punch with enough torque to put someone's lights out for good. Walt didn't retreat. Retreating was a civilian's instinct. He stepped in instead, dropped his center of gravity, caught Colton's bicep on his forearm, and let the momentum sail past. Off balance, Colton stumbled forward. Walt simply placed a palm on the back of his neck and gave a short downward shove. Colton's face hit the canvas. A gasp rippled through the room. Derek, still holding his ribs by the cage, let out a low whistle. Colton scrambled up, humiliation curdling instantly into rage. He abandoned every bit of technique and charged with wild, looping punches. Walt slipped, parried, rolled with the glancing shots, wasting no energy, moving like an old tree weathering a pointless storm. "Fight back, coward!" Colton screamed, throwing a hard roundhouse at Walt's temple. Walt saw it coming a mile away, the dipped shoulder, the opened hips. Instead of blocking it, he stepped forward and jammed his knee into the meat of Colton's thigh. A dull, sickening thud rang out, a direct hit to the nerve. Colton's leg went dead. He collapsed sideways, screaming, clutching his thigh, trying and failing to stand. Walt stood over him, breathing slow and even, not a single closed fist thrown yet. "Like I said, bad habits. Pain's a good teacher, ego's just a stubborn student." At this point, most people would have called it done. Colton wasn't most people. He dragged himself upright, refusing to stay down, blood in his mouth from biting his cheek. He was 24, undefeated, a champion, and he refused to let a janitor be the reason that ended. "I'm not done," he gasped, hauling himself up on a dead leg. Walt just watched him, sadness in his eyes more than anything. "Stay down, kid. You've got nothing left to prove. They don't care about you." He nodded slightly toward the silent crowd. Colton screamed and lunged with everything he had left in a wild, desperate overhand right, aiming to end this for good. Walt sighed and simply stepped off the center line. The punch sailed past his ear. Before Colton could recover his balance, Walt slid an arm under his armpit, wrapped his hand behind his neck, grabbed his triceps and dropped his hips. Colton was pulled face first toward the mat, and this time Walt went down with him, landing squarely on his back, driving the air out of his lungs in one loud, wet gasp. Colton thrashed. He was used to fighting guys his own age, guys who relied on speed and power. Walt felt like a concrete slab. Every attempt to shrimp free or frame an arm was already shut down before he finished the motion. Walt slid his forearm under Colton's chin, locking it in place like an iron bar. Colton clawed uselessly at it with his gloves. "Stop fighting," Walt murmured, right against his ear. Colton twisted, gurgled, kicked his one good leg. Walt tightened his legs around his ribs, compressing his breathing to short, panicked sips. "Look at me," Walt said softly. Colton's eyes darted to the mirror across the room and saw his own reflection, pinned, helpless, broken beneath the man he'd spat on an hour earlier. "You fight for the cameras," Walt whispered. "You fight for the cheering. You fight to feed your ego. That makes you weak." He tightened the choke just slightly, just enough for Colton to feel the floor drop out from under him. The edges of his vision blurred to static gray, his heartbeat pounding in his own ears. "If this were real," Walt said evenly, "you'd already be gone. Your pride is going to get you killed one day." That's the exact moment Colton realized how close to the edge he really was. The panic peaked and then cracked into pure terror. His life in that instant was entirely in the hands of the man he had humiliated all night. His glove slapped the canvas. Once, twice, 3 times. Walt let go instantly. No extra second to make a point. He rolled off cleanly and stood in one fluid motion. Colton stayed on his hands and knees, coughing violently, tears mixing with sweat and dripping onto the mat. It was an ugly sound, the sound of someone's whole self-image collapsing at once. Walt didn't look down at him. He didn't raise his arms. He walked to the edge of the mat, sat, and started lacing his boots back up. The silence in that gym had changed completely. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody filmed it. The performance was over, and something uncomfortably real had taken its place. Walt stood, his knee popping, and shrugged his old jacket back on, buttoning it slow and methodical. Colton finally rolled onto his back on the mat, staring up at the lights, chest heaving, looking like a man who just walked away from a car wreck and was only now realizing whose car it was. Marcus approached the ropes. "Colton, you good man." Colton didn't answer. He couldn't. He dragged himself up using the ropes, waving off Marcus's hand, eyes locked on the old man calmly returning to his mop. Squeak. SHH. Squeak. The rest of the gym slowly thawed. A few guys drifted back to the heavy bags, throwing quieter, less theatrical punches. The music playing overhead suddenly felt out of place. Colton peeled his gloves off with his teeth and dropped them. He began the slow, humiliating limp toward the locker room, every step on his bad leg sending nausea through his stomach. His path took him straight past the water cooler, past the puddle, past Walt. He stopped 2 feet away. Walt paused, resting his chin on the mop handle again, studying the swelling on Colton's lip, the red friction burn crawling up the side of his neck. Colton opened his mouth twice before anything came out. "Where?" he finally managed, voice cracked. "Did you learn to do that?" Walt held his gaze, no smile, no cruelty either. "Places you don't want to go, son, places without mats. You could have broken my leg, you could have put me out completely. I could have. Why didn't you?" Walt leaned in slightly. He smelled like bleach and old wool. "Because breaking a man's bones doesn't fix what's broken in his head. It just makes him angrier and slower. You fight to hurt people, Colton. You fight because you're scared of being small. I used to fight because I had to keep the men next to me breathing." He straightened up, joints cracking. "You've got talent, real speed. But you don't respect the violence you're playing with. Someday you'll throw those hands at someone who isn't interested in teaching you a lesson." Colton stared at him. For maybe the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say back. No comeback, no defense. He just gave a small, painful nod, stepped around the puddle, and disappeared into the locker room, limping hard. Walt watched him go, took a slow breath, and went back to work. Squeak. SHH. Squeak. Half an hour later, the gym had mostly emptied out. Marcus walked over to the supply closet where Walt was wringing out the mop head one last time. He pulled a crumpled 50 from his pocket, hands shaking slightly as he held it out. I had no idea. Walt folded the bill and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Nothing to say. Floor's clean, trash is out. You gonna be okay out there tonight? Supposed to drop below freezing. Slept in colder, Walt said, slinging his duffel over his shoulder and heading for the back door. The metal door groaned open, letting in a blast of cold night air. He stepped into the alley, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving the bright lights and shattered egos of Warhorse Fitness in his wake. He climbed into the back of the old Astro van, sat down on his cot, and unlaced his boots for the second time that night. His knee ached, his shoulder throbbed. He was just an old man again. But as he lay back and pulled the wool blanket up, he had a quiet feeling the gym would be a little different tomorrow. The guys would train a little harder and talk a little less. And maybe, somewhere under all that bruised pride, one 24-year-old had just learned what real strength actually looked like. It's never in the loud mouth or the flexed muscle in the mirror. It's in the man who never needed to prove anything at all. So that's the story. What would you have done if you were standing in that gym? Would you have stepped in or just watched like everyone else? Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from tonight. If this one hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.